This is Chapter 26 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 26. Mark Twain, Lecturer. In spite of the success of his Sandwich Island letters, Samuel Clemens felt, on his return to San Francisco, that his future was not bright. He was not a good all-round newspaper man. He was special correspondent and sketch writer, out of a job. He had a number of plans, but they did not promise much. One idea was to make a book from his Hawaiian material. Another was to write magazine articles, beginning with one on the Hornet disaster. He did, in fact, write the Hornet article, and its prompt acceptance by Harper's Magazine delighted him, for it seemed a start in the right direction. A third plan was to lecture on the islands. This prospect frightened him. He had succeeded in his third house address of 2 years before, but then he had lectured without charge and for a church benefit. This would be a different matter. One of the proprietors of a San Francisco paper, Colonel John McComb, of the Alta California, was strong in his approval of the lecture idea. "Do it, by all means," he said. "Take the largest house in the city and charge $1 a ticket." Without waiting until his fright came back, Mark Twain hurried to the manager of the Academy of Music and engaged it for a lecture to be given October 2nd, 1866, and sat down and wrote his announcement. He began by stating what he would speak upon, and ended with a few absurdities, such as, "A splendid orchestra is in town, but has not been engaged. Also, a den of ferocious wild beasts will be on exhibition in the next block. A grand torchlight procession may be expected. In fact, the public are privileged to expect whatever they please. Doors open at 7 o'clock. The trouble will begin at 8 o'clock." Mark Twain was well known in San Francisco, and was pretty sure to have a good house. But he did not realize this, and as the evening approached, his dread of failure increased. Arriving at the theater, he entered by the stage door, half expecting to find the place empty. Then, suddenly, he became more frightened than ever. Peering from the wings, he saw that the house was jammed, packed from the footlights to the walls. Terrified, his knees shaking, his tongue dry, he managed to emerge, and was greeted with a roar, a crash of applause that nearly finished him. Only for an instant reaction followed. These people were his friends, and he was talking to them. He forgot to be afraid, and as the applause came in great billows that rose ever higher, he felt himself borne with it as on a tide of happiness and success. His evening, from beginning to end, was a complete triumph. Friends declared that for descriptive eloquence, humor, and real entertainment nothing like his address had ever been delivered. The morning papers were enthusiastic. Mark Twain no longer hesitated as to what he should do now. He would lecture. The book idea no longer attracted him. The appearance of the Hornet article, signed, through a printer's error, Mark Swain, cooled his desire to be a magazine contributor. No matter, lecturing was the thing. Dennis McCarthy, who had sold his interest in the enterprise, was in San Francisco. Clemens engaged this honest, happy-hearted Irishman as manager, and the two toured California and Nevada with continuous success. Those who remember Mark Twain as a lecturer in that early day say that on entering he would lounge loosely across the platform, his manuscript, written on wrapping paper and carried under his arm, looking like a ruffled hen. His delivery they recall as being even more quaint and drawling than in later life. Once, when his lecture was over, an old man came up to him and said, "Be them your natural tones of eloquence?" In those days it was thought proper that a lecturer should be introduced, and Clemens himself used to tell of being presented by an old miner who said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know only 2 things about this man. The first is that he's never been in jail, and the second is, I don't know why." When he reached Virginia, his old friend Goodman said, "Sam, you don't need anybody to introduce you," and he suggested a novel plan. That night, when the curtain rose, it showed Mark Twain seated at a piano, playing and singing, as if still cub pilot on the John J. Roe. Had an old horse whose name was Methusalem. Took him down and sold him in Jerusalem a long time ago." Pretending to be surprised and startled at the burst of applause, he sprang up and began to talk. How the audience enjoyed it! Mark Twain continued his lecture tour into December, and then, on the 15th of that month, sailed by way of the Isthmus of Panama for New York. He had made some money and was going home to see his people. He had planned to make a trip around the world later, contributing a series of letters to the Alta California, lecturing where opportunity afforded. He had been on the coast 5½ years, and to his professions of printing and piloting had added 3 others: mining, journalism, and lecturing. Also, he had acquired a measure of fame. He could come back to his people with a good account of his absence and a good heart for the future. But it seems now only a chance that he arrived at all. Crossing the Isthmus, he embarked for New York on what proved to be a cholera ship. For a time there were 1 or more funerals daily. An entry in his diary says, "Since the last 2 hours all laughter, all levity has ceased on the ship. A settled gloom is upon the faces of the passengers." But the winter air of the North checked the contagion, and there were no new cases when New York City was reached. Clemens remained but a short time in New York, and was presently in St. Louis with his mother and sister. They thought he looked old, but he had not changed in manner, and the gay banter between mother and son was soon as lively as ever. He was 31 now, and she 64, but the years had made little difference. She petted him, joked with him, and scolded him. In turn he petted and comforted and teased her. She decided he was the same Sam and always would be, a true prophecy. He visited Hannibal and lectured there, receiving an ovation that would have satisfied even Tom Sawyer. In Keokuk he lectured again, then returned to St. Louis to plan his trip around the world. He was not to make a trip around the world, however, not then. In St. Louis he saw the notice of the great Quaker City Holy Land excursion, the first excursion of the kind ever planned, and was greatly taken with the idea. Impulsive as always, he wrote at once to the Alta California, proposing that they send him as their correspondent on this grand ocean picnic. The cost of passage was $1,200, and the Alta hesitated, but Colonel McComb, already mentioned, assured his associates that the investment would be sound. The Alta wrote, accepting Mark Twain's proposal, and agreed to pay $20 each for letters. Clemens hurried to New York to secure a berth, fearing the passenger list might be full. Furthermore, with no one of distinction to vouch for him, according to advertised requirements, he was not sure of being accepted. Arriving in New York, he learned from an Alta representative that passage had already been reserved for him, but he still doubted his acceptance as one of the distinguished advertised company. His mind was presently relieved on this point. Waiting his turn at the booking desk, he heard a newspaper man inquire, "What notables are going?" A clerk, with evident pride, rattled off the names: "Lieutenant General Sherman, Henry Ward Beecher, and Mark Twain. Also, probably, General Banks." It was very pleasant to hear the clerk say that. Not only was he accepted, but billed as an attraction. The Quaker City would not sail for 2 months yet, and during the period of waiting Mark Twain was far from idle. He wrote New York letters to the Alta, and he embarked in 2 rather important ventures. He published his first book, and he delivered a lecture in New York City. Both these undertakings were planned and carried out by friends from the coast. Charles Henry Webb, who had given up his magazine to come East, had collected "The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County" and other sketches, and, after trying in vain to find a publisher for them, brought them out himself on the 1st of May, 1867. Footnote number 7. The printing was done by John A. Gray and Green, the firm for which the boy Sam Clemens had set type 13 years before. End of footnote number 7. It seems curious now that any publisher should have declined the little volume, for the sketches, especially the frog story, had been successful, and there was little enough good American humor in print. However, publishing was a matter not lightly undertaken in those days. Mark Twain seems to have been rather pleased with the appearance of his first book. To Bret Harte he wrote, "The book is out and is handsome. It is full of errors, but be a friend and say